world is on the cusp of a new century, and the winds of change are blowing across the globe. The Spanish Empire, a once mighty power that had dominated vast territories across the world, is now a fading giant. Its grip on its colonies is weakening by the day, as the forces of nationalism and self-determination rise up against the old order. In the Philippines, a Spanish colony for centuries, the embers of revolution burn bright. The Filipino people, inspired by the ideals of liberty and justice, are determined to break free from the shackles of colonial rule. The Filipino people, led by figures like Emilio Aguinaldo, have risen up against their colonial overlords. Aguinaldo, a charismatic and determined leader, embodies the spirit of the revolution. He and his fellow revolutionaries yearn for the freedom they have long been denied, dreaming of a nation where they can govern themselves and shape their own destiny. The Filipinos fight with courage and tenacity, their struggle echoing the American colonists' own fight for independence over a century earlier. They engage in fierce battles, driven by the hope of a brighter future for their children and the generations to come. Victory seems within their grasp. The Spanish forces are on the retreat, and the dream of an independent Philippines appears to be on the verge of becoming a reality. But on the horizon, a new power looms: the United States of America. Fresh from its victory against Spain in the Spanish-American War, the United States, driven by a potent mix of idealism and ambition, sets its sights on the Philippines. What begins as a seemingly straightforward intervention to liberate the Filipinos from Spanish rule quickly transforms into a complex and bloody struggle for control. The United States, with its growing sense of manifest destiny and a desire to expand its influence, sees the Philippines as a valuable prize. The initial promise of liberation soon gives way to a harsh reality. The Filipinos, who had hoped for an ally in their quest for independence, find themselves facing a new colonial power. The conflict escalates, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The dream of freedom becomes entangled in a web of geopolitical ambitions and conflicting interests. The stage is set for a conflict that will test the very ideals upon which the United States was founded. The principles of liberty and self-determination are put to the test as the United States grapples with its role as a colonial power. The struggle leaves an indelible mark on the relationship between the two nations, shaping their histories in profound and lasting ways. The legacy of this conflict continues to resonate, reminding us of the complexities and contradictions of the quest for freedom and the impact of imperial ambitions on the course of history. The United States embarked on its imperial venture in the Philippines armed with a potent and dangerous ideology, a belief in its own exceptionalism. This belief was not just a fleeting sentiment, but a deeply rooted conviction that America was destined to lead and shape the world. It was a time when the notion of manifest destiny had already taken hold, and the idea of American superiority was widely accepted. Coupled with this sense of exceptionalism was a perceived moral obligation to uplift and civilize what it saw as inferior races. This was often referred to as the white man's burden, a term popularized by Rudyard Kipling, which suggested that it was the duty of white Americans to bring progress and enlightenment to the so-called savage peoples of the world. This paternalistic attitude was not just a justification for imperialism, but a core component of American identity at the time. This paternalistic and racist worldview, deeply ingrained in the fabric of American society at the time, provided a convenient justification for conquest and domination. It allowed Americans to see their actions not as aggressive or exploitative, but as benevolent and necessary. The idea that non-white races were inherently inferior and needed guidance was a widely accepted belief, perpetuated by both political leaders and popular culture. American leaders, from President William McKinley to prominent intellectuals, painted a picture of the Filipinos as ill-prepared for self-governance, needing the guiding hand of a more enlightened nation. McKinley himself spoke of a divine inspiration that led him to annex the Philippines, claiming it was America's duty to educate, uplift, and Christianize the Filipino people. This narrative conveniently ignored the rich cultural heritage and complex social structures that already existed in the Philippines. They argued that annexation was not about imperial conquest, but rather about fulfilling America's divine mission to spread democracy and civilization to the far corners of the globe. This rhetoric was used to mask the economic and strategic interests that also played a significant role in the decision to annex the Philippines. The islands were seen as a valuable asset, both for their natural resources and their strategic location in the Pacific. This rhetoric, imbued with deeply ingrained racial biases, ignored the Filipinos' own capacity for self-determination and their centuries-old culture and history. The American narrative conveniently overlooked the fact that the Philippines had its own revolutionary movement, fighting for independence from Spanish colonial rule long before the Americans arrived. The imposition of American rule was not a welcome liberation, but another form of colonial domination, one that dismissed the aspirations and agency of the Filipino people. The Philippine-American War was not a simple case of a powerful nation steamrolling over a weaker opponent. The Filipinos, despite being outmatched in terms of weaponry and resources, fought back with fierce determination and resilience. They employed guerrilla tactics, using their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage, and launching surprise attacks against the American forces. Brigadier General Marcus Miller, the capture of Iloilo, a key city in the Philippines, exemplifies the brutal nature of the conflict. American forces, frustrated by the Filipinos' stubborn resistance, resorted to scorched earth tactics, burning villages and displacing countless civilians. Filipino insurgent leader. The war devolved into a bloody stalemate, with atrocities committed by both sides, but the brunt of the suffering fell upon the Filipino population. The stated aim of the United States and the Philippines, to liberate the Filipinos from Spanish tyranny and guide them towards self-governance, rang hollow in the ears of many Filipinos as the war dragged on. The promise of freedom and democracy seemed increasingly distant as the conflict intensified, and the reality on the ground painted a starkly different picture. The brutality unleashed by the American military, the forced displacement of civilians, and the suppression of dissent stood in stark contrast to the ideals of liberty and democracy that the United States claimed to champion. Villages were burned, and countless lives were disrupted as the American forces sought to quell the resistance. The harsh measures employed by the military only fueled the resolve of the Filipino fighters, who saw their struggle as a continuation of their fight for true independence. Filipino insurgent leader. "We were fighting for our own independence," wrote Apolinario Mabini, a key figure in the Filipino resistance, "and we were treated like criminals in our own land." Mabini's words echoed the sentiments of many Filipinos, who felt betrayed by the American promise of liberation. Instead of being seen as allies in the fight against Spanish colonial rule, they were now facing a new oppressor. The dream of self-governance seemed to slip further away with each passing day. The war exposed the hypocrisy at the heart of America's imperial project, revealing a nation struggling to reconcile its lofty rhetoric with the brutal realities of conquest. The American public, largely unaware of the true nature of the conflict, was fed a narrative of benevolent intervention. However, the stories and images that eventually emerged from the Philippines told a different story, one of suffering, resistance, and a people determined to fight for their own destiny. The Philippine-American War remains a poignant reminder of the complexities and contradictions inherent in the pursuit of empire under the guise of liberation.